Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us to celebrate the official launch of The Girl from Dream City by Linda Leith. My name is Lohit Jugbani, and I'm part of the marketing team for the University of Regina Press. I'll be your event technician today. We'll start the event shortly, but before we do, I wanted to address a bit of housekeeping. Audience microphones will be turned off for the duration of the event. This event is live and is being simulcast to YouTube. If you would prefer not to have your face in a public video, please refrain from turning on your camera during the event. University of Regina Press is proud to host this event with the Blue Metropolis Foundation. Cultures together to share the pleasures of reading and writing. The foundation hosts the Blue Metropolis Montreal International Literary Festival every year. I also want to acknowledge that the University of Regina Press is located on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional lands of the Nehiyawak, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota nations, and the homeland of the Métis people. The Blue Metropolis Foundation is situated on land which has long served as site of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous people, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We honor and respect the diverse Indigenous people connected to the territory and respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with the Indigenous and other people in Jojage. Today's event will begin with a conversation between Linda Leith and moderator Stephen Beattie before concluding with an audience Q&A. Throughout the event, please submit any questions you have in the chat feature below. While we may not have time to get to every question, we hope to answer as many as possible before the event concludes. A reminder also that you can pick up your copy of The Girl from Dream City at Paragraph Bookstore. You can visit their website at paragraphbooks.com. We will post their link in the chat after these messages. Finally, please be mindful that we strive to facilitate the safest possible space for our authors, panelists, and guests. Please show kindness and respect to everyone in attendance. I'm now pleased to introduce Stephen Beattie, acclaimed critic and writer who until recently was the reviews editor at Quill and Quire magazine. Stephen's writing and criticism have appeared in the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, the Walrus, Canadian Notes and Queries, and several other publications. Stephen, over to you.
Thanks very much, Lohit. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you to University of Regina Press and Blue Met for inviting me to participate in this conversation with Linda Leith on the occasion of the launch of her memoir, The Girl from Dream City, A Literary Life, which I had the opportunity to read several months ago, and it's a fascinating account of Linda's childhood, her education, her literary education, and her really varied professional background. She's known as the founder of the Blue Metropolis International Festival, which is a world-renowned literary festival of its kind. She's also a novelist. She's written nonfiction. She actually wrote for Quill and Quire at one point before my time, but she did reviews for Quill and Quire as well as other literary publications back in the day. And her latest incarnation, of course, is as a publisher of Linda Leith Publications. So I want to get into a little bit of all of that, talk about The Girl from Dream City, but first of all, please help me welcome Linda Leith.
Thank you so much, Stephen. It's great to be here, and it's very nice to see you again, and I look forward to your questions.
It's always a pleasure. I think the last time we saw each other was in Montreal, and you know, it would be lovely if we could do this in person, because obviously, you know, I love the city, and you know, it would be great to have the opportunity to get back there. COVID prevents that. And I guess the first question that I have is, I know you're not running the show anymore, but in terms of Blue Met during a global pandemic. I mean, I guess this is the second year you've had to do this virtually. What's your sense of how the festival has gone in the last couple of years with the COVID restrictions, and Blue Met specifically, but literary festivals in general? What's your sense of how these things have played out?
I have to say, I'm really not involved at all with Blue Metropolis anymore. I mean, it's more than 10 years since I stepped down, and so there's a whole new crew.
Right.
And last year, the festival was planned for just immediately after the shutdown. So in fact, and it had of course been planned as in person.
Sure.
So there was no real festival, although in the weeks and months after that, they did have various virtual events. And so this is really the first virtual festival this year, this week, in fact. I think today is the last official day. And so it's, there's a whole raft of events and fascinating writers from all over the world as usual. And so I think that we are all in our different ways, in different areas where we're adjusting, and we're getting kind of used to this even, which is, and I think this is here to stay. Even when we can meet in person, I think there will be still a lot of virtual events when you're just speaking to someone and it would cost you $10,000 to bring them from Australia.
Sure.
Well, and instead you can do this. You may do this.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think there are a lot of advantages, and I personally have been very cheered by the way in which festival organizers and publishers have been able to accommodate the virtual environments. It must be weird, though, to be launching a book in this way during a pandemic, like you're not able to tour. How's that?
Yeah, well, that's true. I'm not able to tour, and I'm not able to go into a bookshop or a space and have a launch and sign copies. And, there are limitations. There's no doubt about it. I think that that's just the way it is. At the same time, I think, we'll see. I really don't know how. I know Paragraph is selling the books for this event. May they do well. They've been selling events for several other events as well, of mine and many other festival participants, because they are the festival bookseller.
Sure.
So, it's I think the results will emerge at some point, and we'll all know how it all went.
Fair enough. Let's talk about the reason we're here, which is The Girl from Dream City, your memoir, which I kind of tongue-in-cheek, when we talked for a profile that I wrote, one of the last profiles I wrote for Quill and Quiet was a profile of you. And I had my tongue in my cheek when I said that I had the impression that you've been writing this book your entire life. But you kind of came back by saying that's actually not untrue. What was it that made you decide that you wanted to write this book now?
Well, I think it's true that it's been a long time gestating, as it were. And in fact, at some point, I was reminded from something that a reader said to me, that in fact, when I was a kid, I probably was a teenager, I remember at some point, obviously living at home with my, big family. There were 5 kids and my parents, and for a long time, my grandmother as well. So a big household. And I remember at some point, there was some talk about, at some point, we'll have to write about this, because I think we knew we led a life very different from that of, I think, anyone else I've ever met.
Right.
I've certainly met other people who have, lived in different cities, different countries, different languages. But usually the ones that I have met were doing so in the context of, the armed forces or the diplomatic corps or some sort of corporate entity, which means you had a context, whereas we were a nuclear family, sort of going from country to country. And So yeah, it was, I think we're an unusual family.
Were you always the designated storyteller? Were you always the sort of the keeper of the family stories?
I don't think that's true. No, I wouldn't say that. In fact, I think, certainly I from about that same time when I was a teenager, I certainly wanted to write and I was writing, but no, there was no such designated storyteller role. In fact, my two brothers are both writers as well. So in different ways, in different media. And so, no, I mean, I think it, but to go back to your question, your original question, I think that given that background, it also has taken me a very long time to piece it all together, because there were things I didn't understand about why we did this, or why as a family we did that, and why we moved there, or why so many moves and all that. And I think that, in fact, a lot of it came together. It's now about a little more than, it's about almost 10 years since my mother died. My father had died long before that. But in the last 10 years of her life, I was in a position, she lived in southern England, in Kent, in Canterbury. And I was able to visit her, usually twice a year, sometimes 3 times a year. And I would stay at her house and, we would talk. And she was in her 80s, or, she was an elderly lady by this point. And she was forthcoming in a way that made for the most fascinating conversations that I ever had with her in that period. And that's what, and at some point by that time I was a writer, I was a published writer. And so I started taking notes, and she was very happy about that. And she said, that she wants the world to know how interesting her life has been. And it was an interesting life, and it still was at that point. So that's where a lot of it came from.
Right.
Not that long ago,
right.
10, 15 years ago.
You talk about an interesting life and moving around, and the other joke that I made on Facebook was that writing that profile gave me the excuse to use the word peripatetic.
Yeah, I saw that.
Because your family has, as a child, you moved around quite a lot. I'm going to leave some out, but London, Basel, Paris, Germany, I believe at one point, to Montreal, where you eventually went to McGill University before, leaving again, going London again, or Hungary. What was that like for you as a child in such a large family? You have 7 siblings, am I right about that?
No, I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters. So there's 5.
Well, I was way off at 7.
5 of us, my siblings and I make up 5 people, my parents, obviously. And as I said, my grandmother, my mother's mother, lived with us for several years, many years. Well, at the beginning when we moved, it was just my older brother and me. And then at every move, a new member was added to the family, so that my younger brother was born when we lived in London the first time. And then my sister was born when we lived in Basel. And then the youngest, my other sister, was born when we were back in London again, before we came here. So by the time we actually arrived in Montreal, docked at Montreal in 1963, we were a complete family, 5 of us. Right. And I have to say that oddly enough, I knew no other childhood, so that I couldn't compare it to anyone else's. And I think it was gradually as I got older that it did dawn on me that not everybody does live like this. But I I didn't question it because I was not in a position to, first of all, I was not in a position to do anything. I wasn't in a position to change anything. And what was constant was that family unit, which was a big nuclear family and sort of a whole small society all its own. We didn't really know, I didn't know many people outside that family until later on. I think it got to be harder when I was, an adolescent, I think at that point, and I was sort of coming into my own awareness of my life, what I was going to do, my circumstances. And I think that at that point, it was also, famously, adolescence is a tough time. And I had run-ins galore with my father. I'm not such a rebel, really.
You have a bit of a rebellious streak to you.
I guess I do. Anyway, that's the way it went. And but I think in some ways it was hard growing up with that, in that peripatetic way. But it was also it was also of tremendous value. I learned, my second language is German, which I learned in Basel. I spoke German and wrote German better than English because I was there from I was 6 for 3 years, from I was 6 till I was 9. I also learned the local Basler dialect, which was quite different. And then later, when we were back in London, I learned French at school and Latin and then, of course, here we came to Montreal and we were in a French-speaking society. Although I have to say the West Island of Montreal was not as French-speaking as it might be today.
Right. You mentioned Latin. You actually, there's an anecdote in The Girl from Dream City where you talk about getting in trouble for writing something on a Latin test that your teacher, I'll say, didn't appreciate.
She certainly didn't. And I was so shocked by that. I really was. I loved Latin. And this was a very good teacher. And she knew a lot. She had really done a lot of work understanding ancient Rome and the Latin poets and other Latin writers. And she got us in Latin class to translate Latin poetry into English and excerpts from Caesar's war commentaries and speeches of Cicero's and all kinds of amazing things. And we must have, at the time when this incident happened, we must have just been reading Cicero because his words were on my mind. And at some point he had written, "O me miserum," meaning, "Oh, wretched me." And we were doing a test in class and I was very good at Latin because I did love it. And so I finished the test early and then as a kind of, I don't know what I was thinking. I thought it was a joke. I wrote at the end of the test, "O me miseram," knowing, of course, that I had to use the feminine form, but quoting Cicero. And for what might have been the first time in my life ever, using language, Latin in this case, to express myself in a kind of cheeky, mischievous little way. Well, my teacher came storming into class the next day and was furious with me and said, she doesn't want her girls taking her tests taking them lightly. We have to take them seriously. And she gave me 0 on the test, which I did think was a little unfair. In any event,
yes. That was your first encounter with a literary critic.
It was my first encounter with a literary critic. It was not my first encounter with authority, I have to say, since I'd had lots of that and kept on having lots of that. But it was my first experience of getting into trouble from something I have written. And not the last.
Not the last. I want to talk about your experience as a writer and your artistic bent as well, but because you mentioned authority, I also wanted to ask about your relationship with your father. Now, you have spoken in various interviews about how his death devastated you. You also write in the book about his volatility. He was bipolar, although they didn't call it that at that time. And you know, you've written and talked about how you didn't understand what his issue was as a child, and you know, had to learn about that as you know, as you grew up. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with your father and how important it was to your development?
Well, I think it was crucial in so many ways, extremely difficult and often painful. But at the same time, I had great admiration for him as well. He was a very brilliant man, and he was a very charismatic figure. And I learned an enormous amount from him. And my great regret, and it remains a regret, is that it was really, I found it impossible to really have a conversation with him. I think that, and whatever the reasons for that, maybe partly that generation of men who didn't have that experience of communicating very easily. It may be in part his Northern Irish background. It may be he was diagnosed as having what was then called manic depression when I was a very small child, probably 4 or 5 years old. And that, or something along those lines, recurred later on. So, and he was always a very volatile man and easily angered. And so, you know, that's a great regret, because he was a very well-read man. And that was one of the great things about my family. It was a house full of books always. And my father read the nonfiction and the histories and the biographies and then talked about them. So we all learned about Rommel the desert rat and, you know, the villains of the Irish famine and, you know, all the whatever stories came out of what he had just been reading. But when you actually tried to engage with him, it was, he would be more likely angry at me than anything else. So I was wary, always very wary of him. And so that is a great regret.
He worked in the pharmaceutical industry. And
he did. Well, he was a family doctor
right.
in Northern Ireland. And then he joined Sandoz, which was a pharmaceutical company based in Basel. And then later Pfizer.
Right.
Here in Canada, he worked as medical director of Pfizer Canada and as vice president.
And as a result of his profession, he was forced to move around a lot, which is why you as a family relocated so many times. You also write in The Girl from Dream City about a point at which you were a young woman who had an opportunity to go to university, and your parents were relocating to Nairobi, and you decided not to go with them. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that decision in your development?
Yes, well, that was a wrenching decision, because I had, by the time that happened, I had graduated from McGill, and I had a boyfriend who was going to be studying later my husband, who was going to be studying at the London School of Economics in London. And we were all set to go to London. My parents, who were living in Brussels at the time, were moving to Nairobi because my father was going to become the head of Pfizer, the medical director of Pfizer East Africa. And they wanted to keep the family together. I was 21, I think, at this time, maybe 22. And they wanted me to go with them. And I I couldn't do that because first of all, I had a relationship with the man that I did marry 2 years after that. And secondly, I didn't want to, I had had a fraught relationship with my family, and I didn't see what I would do in Nairobi. And indeed, I did go for Christmas and spent a couple of months there. And gosh, it was beautiful, but it wasn't a place that I could find my feet.
Sure.
And indeed, a couple of months after that, my brother was expelled because he didn't have working papers. I wouldn't have had the right to work there. So it wasn't practical.
Right.
But I think what it actually shows is how important to my parents the family was, because that was our whole world, really, until one by one we moved out and married or made our own careers. And that was one of those very tense and difficult moments when a decision had to be made. And I decided to go to London with my boyfriend.
When, during all of your development as a girl and as a young woman, did you decide, I want to be a writer?
I decided when I was about 14 or 15. And I did write. I was writing when I was in high school during some, and I had a wonderful teacher who encouraged me. I even published some of the work I wrote as a teenager in school publications, in the yearbook, in the local paper, in the
Right.
part of the West Island newspaper, and then I went to McGill, and I became I wasn't writing very much during my time at McGill, but afterwards I went to live in Paris, and I thought, oh, now I'm going to write again, and it's not as easy as that. Somehow, it didn't really work. And so it took me many years before I actually got back to writing. And in the meantime, I got a PhD, I got married, I had 3 sons, I had a whole career here, and including writing for Quill and Choir and sundry other publications. And it was only much later, when I was 40, that I really became serious about writing again.
You've been very frank about the difficulties that adhere to being a woman and wanting to pursue an artistic craft.
Yeah.
Do you feel that women starting out today would face the same issues that you faced in terms of having to prioritize either the writing or the family, having to prioritize raising children versus pursuing a literary career? Do you think things have changed?
I'm not 20 or 25 or 30 or 35 anymore. I cannot speak for that generation. But in some ways, things have got much worse because it's much harder to get paid for your writing today than it was in those days.
And that's true across the board.
There were many more magazines, for example.
Right. Well, that's true across the board. That's not specific to women writers.
No, except that is absolutely true. And I would never want to minimize the difficulties for anyone who wants to be a writer. But I think that in terms of women, I think that there is a link, because I think that the best way for a woman to be able to manage a career, which I had a full-time teaching career, a family. I had 3 children and a wonderful dog, and etc. And then a writing career on top of that. Well, what you really need is buckets of money. Because you need some miraculous person who's going to do all the things that you can't fit into too busy a life. So that's where how much you can earn comes into the picture.
Right.
If you were in a position to get, a $200,000 advance on your next book, you would be able to afford this wonderful person who could help out with, the domestic chores, or at least you could then give up your teaching job, and then you'd only have your writing and your family. But when you try to do it all, you get stretched very thin, and
Right.
something has to give. So I think that it simply wasn't really conceivable for me I didn't have the money, the mental space, the time, or the energy to put into writing.
Right.
In those years.
When you talk about money, you did start making, and I know, having been in the review editor's seat at Quill and Choir for more than 12 years, you don't get paid a lot to write reviews in Canada, and that's not specific to any particular time period. That's just a fact across the board. But you did start getting grants at one point out of university to write, and one of the grants that you got was to write a monograph about Mavis Gallant, who you have gone on record as expressing great admiration for. You had a friendly relationship with Gallant. Can you talk a little bit about Gallant and your relationship, and can you start with the point at which he threatened to sue you?
Well, that was right at the beginning. It was not an auspicious start. I had been reading, this was late 70s. I had been reading the most marvelous short stories, as you would well know, Stephen, that Mavis wrote in the 70s and published in the New Yorker, about a character called Lynette Muir, whose life story, born in Montreal, traveled around a lot as a child, came back to Montreal in 1940 and worked here for 10 years as a journalist, etc., before leaving again. Those details had a lot to do with Mavis's own career and her own life. And so I approached her with some questions. I was writing a piece for a new publication, a new magazine called Montreal Review, and it was about Mavis's Montreal stories, which I just thought were the best stories I had ever read about Montreal. And unfortunately, I struck a nerve, which, as everybody knows, is not hard to do, or wasn't hard to do sometimes with Mavis, that could be very prickly. And I think she thought that she said, if I say anything to suggest that there is anything autobiographical about those stories, she will sue me. So, okay, this was a very sort of green writer with very little experience dealing with very prickly literary stars. Anyway, I wrote the piece that I had planned to write. I sent it to her just before publication, and it was published a week later or something. And when she had read it, she said, "Oh, what a relief." And so that was the end of that. And then the following, I forget the dates, but at some point a few months later, I actually was able, I had a Canada Council grant to work on her writings, and I was able to use part of this to travel to Paris and meet her. And so we actually met. I had an offering of a bottle of Tio Pepe sherry, and we basically, between us, pretty much polished it off that afternoon. There was little left, and had just a most fantastic, interesting time, because Mavis was such a brilliant, interesting, funny, witty writer and person. Her conversation was wonderful, and it just flowed, and we enjoyed ourselves, and we basically became friends, and we corresponded for years after that. And of course, I saw her many times later in Paris, in Montreal, in Toronto, when her play was produced at Tarragon Theatre in, I think it was 1981.
Right.
And then again in Montreal, she came to Blue Metropolis and won our International Literary Grand Prix. And I think the last time I saw her was at a gala event in New York City at a space somewhere, a place called Symphony Space in New York, a huge concert hall filled to the rafters with Mavis Gallant's fans from New York. And it was an extraordinary tribute to her. And I was very happy to be there.
I'm glad that you mentioned her humor, because I find a lot of people who read Gallant's work don't cotton on to how funny a lot of it is.
Oh, she's a riot. She's so good. I mean, she's a very subtle writer. We're not, but yes, I think that, in fact, when I was writing about her work, not on that first piece in the magazine about the Montreal stories, but later when I was doing some other writing about her work, I was really writing about how comic a writer she is. Right. And she is, absolutely.
Right. And the whole story about her threatening to sue you over your presuming to call the Linnet Mere stories autobiographical strikes me as humorous as well, because she's on record as saying that they're the most autobiographical thing she's ever written.
I know. And in fact, I mean, within a few months of that whole episode, in fact, I saw in print that she had said, well, they're quasi-autobiographical. I mean, she really didn't need to pick on me in quite that way. But hey, we got past it.
All is forgiven. I should mention that the chat is open for audience Q&A. If you have any questions for Linda Leith, please feel free to enter them in the chat at the bottom of the screen, and we can get to as many of them as we have time for. In the meantime, one of the other things that you told me when we talked for Quill and Choir was that you had this sort of feeling that you founded Blue Metropolis simply so that you could invite Mavis Gallant.
Yes. I mean, I think, there are exaggerations that I'm sometimes guilty of exaggerating, but sure, I thought, one of my missions in life was to make sure that Mavis got better known, because when I first read her in the mid-70s, she was really not known in Canada. She was probably known to some extent. She would have been known to readers of The New Yorker. She did not have, at that point, a Canadian publisher. She was she wasn't a major figure. That all changed in the 80s. And after Doug Gibson started publishing her work here, and after a collection of her Canadian stories called Home Truths came out, and she won the Governor General's Award, etc. I mean, there was a lot of things happened after about 1981. But I always thought of her as being someone I had sort of discovered, which wasn't at all true, but it made me feel rather good. And I really did. I taught when I was teaching. In my teaching career, I taught stories by her, stressing the humor in them and the comedy. And then, well, she when it came time to think about a literary festival, and then to think about a literary Grand Prix that would be given at the festival every year, well, sure, she was at the top of my list of people I'd want to invite, but I wanted to be sure. There's no way I would have invited her the first year, right, because I wanted it to be established as a prize worth winning. And so it was, I think, in the third year, after Norman Mailer was and the Quebec writer Marie-Claire Blais was the winner, the very first winner. And then the third year, it was Mavis Gallant, and she came, and she was so delighted to be feted in Montreal. And she really was.
I only met Mavis once, and the one time I met her was at the Toronto International Festival of Authors down at Harbourfront. And her only advice to me was to avoid using adverbs.
Yes.
She said they weaken prose. That's like the one thing I took from Mavis Gallant. The great lesson that I took from Mavis Gallant was avoid using adverbs.
Well, probably it's good advice.
It's advice well taken. Gallant at that point had been living in Paris for many years. She lived there for over half a century, but she did start out in Montreal, the Linnet Ware stories and Montreal stories. And you have also been on record, and it's in The Girl from Dream City, talking about how when you started reading Canadian literature, the people that you gravitated towards were Leonard Cohen, Mordecai Richler, Gabrielle Roy, Marie-Claire Blais. They were all Montreal writers. They were all Quebec writers. Yeah. What was it about the Quebec writers that attracted you?
It's very interesting, and it's absolutely true, because when I came back, having finished my studies in London in 1974, I got married and moved back to Montreal and started teaching here at John Abbott College. And okay, I'm going to be living. This is where I'm now living. I'm going to be a Canadian. And which it hadn't been entirely clear to me before that, because I was so peripatetic. And so I set about reading Canadian books and reading Canadian writers wherever. And it was a perfect time to be doing that in the mid-70s. There was a whole wave had just sort of crested, and there were obviously so many future waves to come. And I was reading everybody. And I greatly admired many writers, Michael Ondaatje, Margaret Lawrence, Margaret Atwood. I mean, there's Alice Munro, there's a long list. But the ones that really intrigued me, which I think is probably the right word, were Quebec writers, Francophone writers working in French, the ones that you've mentioned, Gabrielle Roy, Marie-Claire Blais, Hubert Aquin. They were all, there's a long list there as well. And also Quebec writers working in English, such as Leonard Cohen, Mordecai Richler, Mavis Gallant, Brian Moore, and on and on. So that came to be what I then really focused on in my writing, my critical writing and my writing about literature. I wrote reviews of many authors from across Canada, and articles that included them and all sorts of different pieces. But there was always, and to a growing extent, a focus on writing out of Quebec. And to this day, that remains a great, an abiding interest of mine. I don't know why it is. These are writers that interest me more than others. And I think it must have something to do with cultural exchange. I led this childhood across and between and in different cultures. And in some ways that's where I'm at home.
Right.
It's not in one place, it's in a place that's a mix.
Right.
And this is a place that's probably is a great mix in so many ways.
Right. Right. You and I have talked before about, my feeling that Quebec has long had some of the most interesting writing coming out of it of any region in Canada, and specifically Francophone Quebec, although there's some interesting stuff coming out of English Quebec too. People like Arjun Basu, Heather O'Neill, Dimitri Nasrallah, Sean Michaels. It's still an incredibly vibrant literary scene, and I kind of wonder what Quebecers are drinking in their water, because it's just a series of really, really interesting stuff that I don't see happening anywhere else. And we could talk about that kind of thing until the cows come home, but we do have a question from the audience, which I'd like to turn to for the moment. And the question is, which of your literary endeavors are you most proud of? Have there been any projects that you found especially rewarding? And I mean, you have had a career that has involved writing, salonier, now publisher. Is there any aspect of those that you find particularly rewarding?
Well, I think that in some ways I have found everything rewarding. That's why I've done it, is that I've found it to be these many jobs that I've done, all kinds of literary jobs, from running a magazine, becoming a writer, translating, Blue Metropolis, publishing. I've done them, and I'm doing them because that's what I want to do, and I find that it's very rewarding to do it. There are some high points. I mean, I have to say, the publication of my first novel, which I wrote when I lived in Budapest, Birds of Passage, was a great moment for me, because I had really wanted to be a writer and to publish a novel specifically, and I did, and then others, and that was wonderful. I have always greatly enjoyed and thrived on the kind of social ferment in the literary scene here in Montreal. Whether it's Francophone, Anglophone, allophone, or whatever the mix may be. And that has been that's been a joy, and it was already with the magazine, which I published and edited in the late 80s, Matrix magazine. And then, of course, it came to a sort of crescendo, let's say, with Blue Metropolis, which was a project of such enormous scale, right, and reach. I mean, it was at times overwhelming because it was such a massive job. But I'm very proud of it, and I still think that it was a great addition to the Montreal scene, and continues to be.
How important was the international aspect of Blue Met for you?
Very, very.
Why?
Because I think partly that's my natural milieu. Right. So there's that. But I think there were some strategic reasons as well, because it was Blue Metropolis emerged out of circumstances that English language writers here in Quebec had been living through over a previous, whatever the length of time, couple of decades, right, let's just say. Right. And when English Canada, to speak very generally, basically didn't have a lot of interest in anyone who was English speaking in Quebec. What was interesting in Quebec was very much French. Right. And French political aspirations, nationalist aspirations, culture, you name it. And so people who were so interested and so focused on Francophone Quebec didn't necessarily spend a lot of time thinking about Anglophone Quebec or immigrant Quebec or whatever other Quebecs there are. And in a different way, for different reasons, Francophone Quebec had no particular interest or knowledge of what English language writers, people working here in English, and there were always many, but they weren't on the radar. Right. If you were, because they were building their own national literature, their own culture, and that was their focus. And they also had international reach and whatever, but they didn't have a lot of interest in us. So at some point in the late 90s, I think there was more and more among, I was working with a whole bunch of other writers, and who were working in English, and there was a certain kind of feeling that we've got to do something. And when it came time, I had never been to a literary festival when Blue Metropolis came into being. So it was really invented here out of whole cloth.
Right.
And it was invented as a multilingual, well, initially bilingual, and then almost immediately it became multilingual festival. Unlike any that existed anywhere at the time, and I don't think any exists quite like that today either, in any event. And it was international because we had basically decided in our isolated little, literary milieu here, we had decided that we wanted to bypass Toronto, Stephen. And bypass,
Here.
whoever was ignoring us, we would just go over their heads and go international. And that's what we did.
Fair enough.
And frankly, I think it worked.
I think it worked beautifully. We're running out of time rapidly. We do have one more question from the audience, just very quickly. Do you have any advice for new writers or critics in Canada looking to start their career? Are you accepting submissions?
Well, tough times to be a small press in Canada, or I'm sure anywhere these days. It's tough times being a writer, actually, for reasons we touched on in terms of launching a book during a pandemic. I think it's a very good time to write good work. In lockdown, just get it done, and the world will open up, and then you can send it out. One of the pieces of advice that Mavis always had for Canadian writers in general, which I think was excellent advice, and it had nothing to do with adverbs. It was that a writer should go her own way, his or their own way. And I think she felt that we should, and that might have something to do with, what's in the water here in Montreal, because we were isolated in so many ways from, the English Canadian majority. And so we had to go our own way. There was no other way that we could go. And I think it's good advice, not only for a group, but for individual writers to do their reading, do a lot of reading, and find your own path, and then that's your path, stick to it.
Right. It's good advice, and I think it's a very good place to end on, because we are very rapidly running out of our allotted time. But it was great talking to you as always. As I say, I wish we could have done this in person, but it was wonderful to see you virtually as well. Thank you to everybody who attended today's launch. Thank you to University of Regina Press for publishing The Girl from Dream City. And I should remind everybody that books are available through Paragraph Books, the official bookseller of Blue Metropolis.
Here it is.
And you can pick it up through paragraphbooks.com. Thank you, Linda. This has been wonderful, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
This has been fun. Thank you.
It's always fun, and I hope that we get to do this again at some point, face to face.
I hope so too.
Thanks very much. Thank
you, everybody.
Thank you all for coming and participating.